Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome again to our Stories of Pensacola, Florida, one of North America's oldest communities. Now, in our first episode, we talked about the early explorers who followed Columbus into this area and who, over time, over a period of about 50 years, visited either Pensacola itself, the future Pensacola, or some of the areas surrounding it from which they drew information. That information included where Indian tribes might be located, and of course the desirability of Pensacola or Ochuse or whatever name the Indians might have given it as a future Spanish settlement. We had talked in the early days about the work of Ponce de Leon, and then of Leon, Francisco Leon, and then Pamphilo de Narvaez, and of course Hernando de Soto and his followers, and of course the work that was done here in making maps of this area, which the Spanish leadership could say in the future, this is a desirable place for us to begin a colony. We move forward now from the days of Hernando de Soto, which of course put us in the period of 1540. We move forward about 15 years to another one of those long dynastic wars that broke out and was fought across most of Western Europe. This ended in 1555 with what was known then as the Peace of the League of Augsburg. And when that happened, you have certain things that begin to come to the fore in European diplomacy. Number one, by 1550, all of the major powers were well aware that there was a new major continent here, and every one of them wanted a piece of it. Now, when peace came to Europe, there were these factors to be considered. Number one, England, which of course had just passed through the time of King Henry VIII and his first two children, England now had a new queen. And Queen Elizabeth and her people were well aware of North America. But England was dead broke. They were still going through religious difficulties. The community was divided. And though the English wished to move, they realized that at that point they could not. In France, this was a similar situation. The French had expended huge amounts of capital and resource in the war, and they too wished to come forward with an expedition of some sort to make a claim to North America. However, right at the end of that war, their beloved king, Henry II, was killed in a tournament. This left his wife, Catherine, who was the former Catherine de' Medici, as a regent for her two young sons. And Catherine, of course, also had the same problem that Elizabeth did. The country was broke. They wanted to come, and they had religious differences because the new Huguenot religious group was causing all sorts of problems for the monarchy. In Spain, however, things were different. Spain was now enjoying regular annual shipments of tribute coming from the Indian societies in North America, North and South America. Money was flowing in. That was not an object. And they had plenty of manpower, although by now, of course, a good deal of the young Spanish manpower was going to the Western Hemisphere because they saw opportunities there, as most young people would. But now the king, who by now was young King Philip II, and his council, which was led, by the way, by a very able man named Jimenez, the council and the king decided now is our time to put a fence around North America to secure it for all time to be Spanish. About the same time, something else happened it caused a little bit of a problem, but not a serious one for the Spanish. About now, the question came up as who should control all of this vast Western Hemisphere? Of course, nobody really knew what it was, but in all his wisdom, the Pope at that time, his name was Alexander V, said, I'm going to draw a line from north to south, across north to south through the Western Hemisphere, and everything that is east of that line will belong to Portugal, and everything that is west of it will belong to Spain. Of course, the English and the French and others later on totally disregarded what the Pope had done, but the Spanish and the Portuguese did abide by it, which even today tells us why Brazil is Portuguese and all of the rest of South America is Spanish. But basically, at least in their antecedents. But that's how it all began. Well, the plan for settlement in the New World, or in North America by the Spanish was to be totally different. We have to realize that by now, by the middle 1550s, the Spanish had been in the New World for over half a century. They were very successful. Their sugar plantations were bringing huge amounts of money back home. People were making a lot of money. But they realized that they had made some terrible mistakes. They had treated the Native Americans badly. They had tried to put them into make them as slaves, and that certainly did not work. They had downtrodden the native tribes. They had given them no say in their own countries. And so the Spanish said, okay, if we're going to go into North America, we're going to do things right. We won't handle things that way. We're going to approach this with, well, using a 21st century word, we're going to approach all this with a new sense of compassion. And so we're going to put together not simply a little expedition. We're going to put together a real task force that will do the job of putting all of North America in our grasp. Now, to do this, we're not going to simply put a colony here or one colony over here. We're going to put together a team that will build a force that will allow us to literally fortify and occupy both the Gulf area and the Atlantic. And this was not a simple colony, but a whole task force. Now, here in the United States, we have to realize how things like that might have gone about. Back, for example, when President Kennedy decided in the early 1960s that our country was going to put a man on the moon, we didn't approach that by taking a tin cup around and asking the Rotary Club and the Kiwanis Club and others to pitch in to provide the funding for it. No, this was a government project from start to finish, and of course was highly successful. In Spain at this time, things went a little differently. The plan was, of course, for the Spanish government to provide part of the funding for ships and for soldiers and for some of the armament that would go. But the balance of it was to be, the balance of the cost was to be borne by whoever was chosen to be the governor of the expedition. And of course, the governor and his family would put up a lot of the money, but they would also reap a lot of the rewards that would hopefully come as a result of what they did. And so they began to search now for a person, a man who would meet all of the conditions that they wanted to impose in this new set of settlements. And they had these 5 points. They said at this point they wanted to be sure that whoever was there was a fine soldier. Secondly, they preferred to have someone who had come to the Western Hemisphere and had seen what it was like, so that he would have that experience. Third, they wanted to have a man who was well respected in the church. Fourth, they wanted to have a man who had proven compassion in dealing with the Native Americans. And finally, of course, the man and his family had to have enough money to provide some of the funding for the trip. So they began to work to look at potential candidates. Man number one, well, he looked very good, except, well, his compassion level might be a little bit off. Number two was very good too, but he had never been to North America. Now, number three was fine, but, well, his family fortune was a little on the shaky side. So they went from man to man to man, but finally they came to Don Tristan de Luna y Arellano. He was from an old, much respected Spanish family, a rich family. His father had been very active in administration in the New World, and Tristan de Luna had come to North America some years before and had been part of the expedition of Coronado as they marched across the Southwest. And of course, this was the same expedition that ultimately discovered or fell upon, if you will, the Grand Canyon and other sites there. Tristan de Luna was the man. So, basically, they put it all together and they said, Tristan, will you do it? And so de Luna said, well, of course, to do this, I must get the approval of the rest of my family. And he went to them. They went over the entire plan, and the agreement was made, yes, we will do it. So now the plan was made. We had the concept, and we had the coming of the funding, and the decision now was made that the plan was going to go like this. Point number one, they were going to put together not the simple components of a colony, but a great task force. And they estimated this was going to take about 1,550 people. That meant soldiers, meant people who were capable in all of the trades. There would be farmers, there were wives, there would be children, there would be slaves, everything that the Spanish felt would be necessary, not for one, but for 2 settlements. Now, all of this would be put together at the port of San Juan de Ulúa, which is today's Veracruz on the eastern shore of Mexico. And all of these people would be assembled there. They would sail from there and land here at what we call Pensacola today, which the Spanish then gave the Indian name of All would land, and about 400 of the people would be left here to begin a colony. The balance would march north about 200, what they thought was about 200 miles, to where De Soto had wintered some 15 years before among the Coosa Indians. And there the Spanish would establish, well, I guess today we would call it a sort of a way station, about 150 people that would be there to help them with supplies, transfer of people back and forth as this was needed. Then the balance would march across the mountains, and of course their geography was a little off there because they estimated this was about 150 miles. Actually, it was all the way to the east coast, but they were going to reach the point where Francisco El Leon had made his discoveries some 30 years before, and this was to be the site of the second colony. So all of this was the grand plan, and this was what DeLuna was to lead. Well, beginning in 1558, they began to put it all together. Now, of course, a key figure in the assembly of all of this was the viceroy in Mexico, Juan Sebastian Velasco, and Juan had as one of his lieutenants a lieutenant colonel in the Spanish army, and his name was Juan Serran Saavedra. And Saavedra was to put together, his job was to go about and begin to gather all of the tremendous amount of food and other stores that they were going to need, because the estimate on paper now was that this assembly of 1,550 people were going to have to be supplied with this original shipment for 2 years, because they recognized it was probably going to take 2 years or more before they could clear land, plant crops, and be supplied on their own. So basically the idea was they would assemble, get everything that they did, and this was Juan Serran Saavedra's job. Most of the tradespeople, the professions and others would be coming out of Mexico, while the soldiers would have been part of the men who had been discharged from the army recently after the war that we just mentioned. Okay, all things ready, they are ready to move. Now, to transport all of this, the Spanish government supplied 13 vessels. They were to be under the direction of an admiral who was a most active man. He had been in the treasure fleet for several years. He knew the area well. His name was Gomez Arias. And all these the soldiers, the initial supplies from Spain, made the crossing, landed in Mexico, and now we began to put the whole thing together. Now, as they did all of this, DeLuna, of course, arrived there with his lieutenants, and they marched up to Mexico City, where they met with Viceroy Velasco and some of the other leaders there. And there they were introduced to another component of this a very important part of this expedition, and this was the 7 Dominican friars who were to be the religious element in the story. They realized, the king, the council, everyone realized that they needed to have friars who were very capable men, experienced men, who would, of course, provide spiritual guidance for all of the people who were making the settlements, but their goal, of course, also was to spread out and bring the word of the true faith to all of the Indians that they could possibly reach out for. And the leader of this group of 7 was named Domingo de Santo Domingo, who, of course, became a very key part of the story. Also, a key part, another man that we want to remember well, is a Major Mateo del Sauz. He is the head of the cavalry that is part of the entire group. And of course, we're now in Mexico, and all of the final details are made, and these are hammered out in the final meetings in Mexico City. And the last thing they did there was to hold a high mass in the recently completed beautiful new cathedral there in Mexico City. Well, they did that, and then the leaders marched down to San Juan de Ulúa, and of course the viceroy went with them. Well, the given day arrives. All 1,550 people are gathered there on the quay shore, and of course the viceroy, he realizes he'll never have another opportunity to speak like this. And remember, it's July, it's hot, it's Mexico. The viceroy reportedly spoke for 4 hours. DeLuna, the compassionate, was to follow him. He got up on the same rostrum and he spoke for 5 minutes. At this point, late in the afternoon, all of the people begin loading their materials and so forth on the ships, because that evening they are to sail with the tide. And so on the 17th day of July in the year 1559, all of this comes together at San Juan de Ulúa, and they are ready to sail. And that night, of course, Gomez Arias, the admiral, hosts DeLuna for a dinner in the cabinet, and that's where they are as our second episode ends. And we hope you'll tune in for the next episode, which will tell exactly what happened next as the DeLuna expedition sailed from San Juan de Ulúa toward Oshus and Florida.